The populist politician Geert Wilders has brought down the Dutch parliament after less than a year in power. The far-right leader pulled out of the four-party coalition over immigration policy, saying it's not tough enough. The political turmoil comes as the Netherlands is set to host a major NATO summit later this month. So, what's next for the country's future? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, a snap election has been called for October in the Netherlands after the coalition government collapsed. Geert Wilders, leader of the Freedom Party, left after demanding further action be taken on immigration. But will the move make him more or less likely to fulfil his ambition of becoming Dutch Prime Minister?
The man who caused the Dutch parliament to collapse, Geert Wilders, leader of the far-right Freedom Party, pulling his party out of the country's coalitions in a row over immigration and asylum policy. He demanded a 10-point plan was enforced to make radical cuts to migration.
People in the Netherlands are increasingly feeling like a stranger in their own city and strangers in their own neighbourhood, sometimes even a stranger in their own street, and that they no longer know their country. They no longer recognise themselves and their cultures.
The Prime Minister Dick Schoof has resigned with the country plunged into political uncertainty.
In recent days, I have repeatedly informed all four party leaders that, in my opinion, the fall of the cabinet was unnecessary and irresponsible.
A snap election has been scheduled for the end of October. Wilders believes he will come back stronger, despite recent polls showing his party's popularity has fallen.
I'm striving to become the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, to run in the election again and ensure that the PVV will be bigger than ever.
At the last elections, Wilders' party won most of the votes. The next will be fought around the issue of immigration. But with his popularity waning, will this gamble backfire?
Well, let's meet our guests here in the studio. I'm delighted to say I've Adam Boulton. He's journalist, broadcaster and political editor. In Amsterdam, we have Geertan Waling. He is a historian and co-author of the unauthorized biography Geert Wilders, Die Wreker, or The Avenger. In Groningen, also in the Netherlands, we have Adrian Favero. He's Associate Professor of European Politics and Society at the University of Groningen. And from Guelph in Ontario, Canada, we have Koning. He is Associate Professor at the University of Guelph. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Geertan, to you, first of all, I mean, you know Wilders. He's never struck me as the kind of team player you need to make a coalition government work.
That's a good description of Wilders. He has been a loner for a long time and someone who is very interested in his own political goal, and that is, you could say, also the goal of his fans, of his voters, and it is to represent their interests and their worries and their anger also in Parliament as an anti-establishment politician. And yeah, for the last year he was an establishment politician because he was taking part of a coalition with his party. And I think that really sort of struck him as something new and something undesirable after a year.
Adrian, to you, are you in any way surprised that Wilders has done this?
No, I'm not. He has done this before in 2012 with the first Rutte coalition, where he wasn't official part, but supportive of it. And he moved out of this one. And just this February, he actually threatened to leave the coalition that he was in. So no, this does not surprise me because this has been his go-to move.
Adam, you've interviewed Geert Wilders over the years. I mean, this was a guy who at one stage was actually banned from coming to the UK, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think he was. Although he did come, of course, subsequently. I interviewed him, I think, at the most memorable time was at the 2016 Republican Convention in the United States. And I think that is significant in as much as, like Nigel Farage in this country, he is someone who has been around on the populist right of politics for a very long time and who has seen himself, although, quite correctly, just been described as a bit of a loner, as part of a general movement. And of course, the big daddy of that movement has become Donald Trump, President Trump. And, he was feted almost by Trump supporters at that particular convention.
Adam, you used the word populist leader. These guys thrive on upheaval. Why is that? Why is he constantly churning and creating problems?
Well, they thrive on dissatisfaction that conventional mainstream parties, in Europe, certainly the socialists and Christian Democrat conservatives, the electorate feels disappointed, and a politician like Wilders points to their failures, particularly, obviously, a long-time salient issue for him is the question of immigration. I mean, the interesting difference, if you like, is that Trump managed to take over a mainstream party in a two-party system, whereas Wilders, Nigel Farage are trying really to push their countries towards a multi-party system. In a multi-party system, it is easy to get a foothold, but it's much more difficult to form a majority government, obviously.
Thanks, Adam. Geertan, to you, it's no coincidence that Wilders chose the issue of migration to pull the pin on the government and the coalition, is it? You just give us your thoughts on him and migration and Dutch society.
Well, the Dutch society has a lot of issues with migration, also because there's a huge shortage of housing and other problems that comes with being a small and highly densely populated country. And I think that addressing the migration issue, and especially the asylum issue, which is not the greatest part of the migrants in coming to the Netherlands, but it is a very visible and very touchy subject, especially because the Netherlands have a lot of Dutch people have the feeling that their borders are not well controlled, and that there's something that's out of our hands as government. So I think that's a very good issue that appeals to the fears and also worries, and also I think legitimate claims to the people to have something to say about who comes in the country and not. So I think that's a legitimate issue that is being used by Wilders now to drop the government or to withdraw from government and to have new elections this fall. In which he takes a gamble that he will get even more seats in parliament, whereas he already has a quarter of the seats in parliament right now, which is a historically high number. So I think it's maybe, and it's not a very wise gamble of him strategically, but it's not a surprise indeed that the asylum immigration issue is the reason why he now pulls back, and he wants to show that because this government that he took part in did not achieve enough for his voters, that it's now time to have new elections.
Let's bring in Edvard. To you, what kind of message does Wilders send now to people who voted for him to sort out migration in the Netherlands, and he's walked away from government? I mean, many of his supporters must be very angry.
So there are hardcore PVV or Freedom Party supporters who will probably take this mostly as, see, here's more evidence that Wilders cannot get things done because he's being blocked by other politicians and institutions in the Netherlands. So it's more evidence that there is this established elite that prevents people like Wilders from pursuing the kinds of policy changes that are necessary. I think that's maybe 15 to 20% of the people who vote for it, or sort of like of the electorate. And so obviously the support he's been able to draw is larger. So it's more interesting to know what the other 10 or so percent think. And I think what you're looking at is a general pattern that you often see with populist parties. When they join governments, they struggle to fulfill their election promises because they're often tend to be made in pretty simplistic terms and to make very bold suggestions that are not always very legally feasible.
Adrian, to you, has Wilders lost the trust of the electorate now because of this?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and probably one that remains to be seen. I mean, the other parties already use what happened sort of to portray him as somebody who can't be trusted, who is unstable, who puts him first before the country. So I do think that is an issue, again, because it doesn't happen for the first time. And as mentioned before, he takes a gamble on this because I think that's a risky move because at present it could be even more used by the other parties in the upcoming campaign to portray him as somebody who cannot be trusted and who does not care about the country but only about himself.
Adam, to you, what was your assessment of Wilders then, the time you spent with him, interviewing him? I mean, you've interviewed so many world leaders over the last 5 decades. How does he compare?
Well, he's successful compared, for example, to Marine Le Pen or indeed Nigel Farage, in as much as he's got as far as playing an active role in government. Although, we should stress he only got about a quarter of the votes. That was the largest single party last time round. And he has succeeded, at least, in getting past some of the strongest immigration laws in Europe during his time in supporting this latest government. I mean, we shall see whether this move to step down is a good move or a bad move, because it does, put the Netherlands in a very awkward position. They've got a kind of acting prime minister in Dirk Schoof who's staying on. He's about to host a NATO summit, where a former Dutch prime minister is going to call for increase in defence spending by NATO. And of course, all this is taking place in the shadow of the continuing Ukraine conflict. So, there are a lot of big issues that if, as it were, Wilders is back on the campaign trail for the election, he's going to have to take positions in which may not necessarily resonate with the wider Dutch electorate.
And just looking at that NATO summit, Adam, what are the optics on this? I mean, it doesn't look great, does it? You've got Rutte coming back in and the Dutch political house in chaos.
Yeah, I mean, it's awkward to be hosting a major summit when you are just a caretaker prime minister. I mean, we've had this before with European summits and G7s, but I think it will make it harder just by the fact that the Netherlands is in political turmoil. It will probably make it harder to make really, agreements that really stick. People will, be looking over their shoulders as to, how much they can trust everyone around the table to be there, let alone to deliver.
Thanks, Adam. Geertan, to you, what's been the reaction of the Dutch public then? I mean, people probably weren't that surprised, but are they upset to see a government fall all because Wilders has effectively thrown his toys out of the pram?
Yes, I think definitely it was already said that a part of his electorate and part of the larger electorate is very disappointed in him because they wanted to actually address these issues that he was also so successful in getting all these votes for 2 years ago, which migration is one, but there's several others, as has been mentioned just now in this conversation. I think it's so important to underline that now all the other politicians are actually portraying the picture that Wilders Wilders is not capable of being in government, shouldn't be governed with again in the future. And that's, of course, very logical after this sudden move of his side, and also consider their electoral strategies that are, of course, want to exclude Wilders and his PVV in the future, which is all clear. But it's also important to underline that actually Wilders is being a very good representative of the people, in the sense that he does feel that these issues need a much more radical approach, whereas, of course, they are restricted by the Dutch laws, by international treaties. But you see inside this government with Wilders and the other parties, we saw actually the new divide, not the right and the left-wing side of politics, but the democratic side of politics and the side of the rule of law, the treaties, the Dutch government being restricted by their own laws. And I think that's having that in one coalition, that struggle, that societal struggle as well, that really is dominant in our public debate now, was quite refreshing. And for that reason, it's not a very good thing that now this bridging the divide will never happen again in the foreseeable future.
Adrian, where does this leave Wilders now in terms of any future coalition building? Because surely other political leaders will look at this and just think, here's a volatile guy who will just walk away as soon as he's not happy.
The leader of the second biggest party, Dylan Jezielgus, actually ruled out to have a new coalition with Geert Wilders, or to invite him to form a new coalition. Other parties have done this before. So again, difficult for him unless he gets the majority of the votes and then doesn't need a coalition. But in the Dutch system, this is highly unlikely. So I think there's a bit of a scorched earth now with the other parties that he needs to form a new coalition.
And Edvard, Wilders has made no secret of the fact he wants to be Dutch Prime Minister. But right now, that looks a very remote prospect.
Yeah, I would say so. I think I would echo what Adrian just said. At the same time, I don't know how much promises are worth from politicians who are currently saying, I would never govern with Wilders again. Certainly, that's the politically expedient thing to say right now. But when the elections are held and the seats are distributed in a way that makes it impossible to govern without the Freedom Party, I could see parties backing up on those statements. And but the fact remains that even in this instance of coalition formation, it proved really difficult to get any parties on board with a government that was spearheaded by Geert Wilders as the prime minister, and that's why they came up with this whole construction of Dick Schoof as a sort of an independent, nonpartisan prime minister that was effectively running a coalition in which the Freedom Party was the largest party, but it seemed too politically volatile or touchy to run such a coalition with actually Geert Wilders as the prime minister. So I think the chances of that in the immediate future are indeed smaller now than they were a year and a half ago.
Thanks, Edvard. Adam, a lot of these populist leaders seem to be just like a one-trick, one-policy, one-issue politician. Migration, obviously, is that issue for Wilders in the Netherlands. And yes, he's had power, he's been in coalition, and he's changed nothing. I mean, what does that tell the electorate?
Well, as they would say in politics, he's moved the Overton window in terms of what is acceptable and unacceptable for politicians to work towards. And clearly in the migration and immigration area, that you could claim was a success, although now outside government, he has to say, well, the government is failing to deliver on what I've promised. I mean, it's important to note that if we're talking about populism, the fact that Wilders has come out doesn't mean that within Europe there aren't some quite significant successes. You know, we've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, who basically transformed his party from a mainstream party to a populist nationalist party. We've got Prime Minister Meloni in Italy, you know, coming from a very far-right party, you know, and only in the last few days we've had an election of Nawrocki in Poland from Freedom and Justice Party, again, one of the parties with these values. So, you know, they are still resonating with quite a lot of the European electorate. And of course, as we had here in our local elections, you know, we've now got Reform UK mayors loyal to Nigel Farage, and they got more councillors. They did better than anyone else in the recent council elections. And indeed, you know, there never used to be Reform or their predecessor parties didn't have representation in Parliament. We've now had 6 MPs elected to Parliament from Reform UK. So, you know, this is a continuing political struggle with clearly identifiable new forces.
Thanks, Adam. Geertan, do you think Wilders has now very cleverly put migration at the heart of the next Dutch election with his behaviour?
I think he tried so, and that's of course the reason why he pulled out on this topic. But having the NATO summit in The Hague just right in front of us next week or in 2 weeks' time, all the international conflicts that also permeate in the Dutch public debate and the Dutch consciousness of what's going on in the world. I think the second party, the party of former Prime Minister Mark Rutte and currently leader Dylan Jesselgus, I think is much more is better on that issue of international security and defense spending. So in the light of that, all those new events, I think Wilders might have taken the wrong gamble here. But he's a very clever politician, very successful in his strategies, especially when it comes to directing the attention of the public debate in election campaigns. So I'm curious to see what will happen over the summer when we move towards the elections at the end of October.
Adrian, as much as we see headlines about the Netherlands and migration, and Wilders' name is always in that conversation, do you think Dutch people genuinely care as much about migration as politicians do, or is it cost of living, money in their pocket at the end of the month that will drive them towards a party when the elections happen?
No, I think there's sort of two sides to this that need to be unpacked. I think on one hand, the Dutch people, and this was mentioned before, do care about asylum, about immigration and migrants. But that topic is connected to other issues such as jobs, housing, salaries and income. And I think it depends a little bit on where the campaign is going, because Wilders is obviously focusing on making migrants sort of the main issue that explains all the other issues. But I think the other parties do have a good chance to say, no, actually, we want to talk about housing. And that is not just only connected to migration, but there's other issues connected to the issue of housing. And if the other parties can successfully do this, I think there's a good chance that they do address problems that the Dutch society also sees without always making them ultimately a migration issue.
Edvard, to you, the same issue, migration, when this election happens in a few months' time in the Netherlands. I mean, Wilders has put that at the heart of his political life, and yet he gets into power and nothing much changes. What does that tell the Dutch electorate?
Well, I think this is one of the main challenges in the politics of migration, is that it is, as we briefly alluded to in parts of this conversation, a pretty challenging subject. And the governance of migration is inhibited by a number of factors. So sort of like flows of migration across the world, if there's conflict somewhere, so there's what we call push and pull factors. Then there's all kinds of constraints that the state has in managing migration in terms of legal constraints, in terms of domestic interests, in terms of how making changes in one policy area might affect what happens to flows in a different policy area. And so all of that to say is that migration management quickly becomes a little bit more boring than the average voter would want to hear. And so the populist message is, it is all very simple and we just need to close the borders. And that is a promise that cannot be kept.
Thanks, Edvard. Adam, he's a very good communicator, though, isn't he, Wilders? The message lands every single interview he does.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very striking person. He's obviously got striking looks with that swept-back white hair. He's not a particularly tall person, but he always, tends to dress the same way in sort of bright blue suits. And that, you can see similarities with the identity of a Donald Trump figure or indeed a Nigel Farage figure. Now, the success, if you like, of Farage and Trump is that they have seen the biggest, perhaps most charismatic figures, whether or not people love them or hate them, compared to other political leaders. And what I don't know is whether within Dutch politics there are equivalent leaders. Everyone knows, Frans Timmermans on the sort of liberal green wing. But to what extent is the personality of Wilders what has given his party success, the Party for Freedom, and how far can that spread out into a wider appeal? Because certainly it does appear at the moment that is the vital step for populists to be able to get more figures out into the public eye.
Thanks, Adam. Geertan, what is it about Wilders that just punches through with Dutch people? Because, he looks very different. He speaks in a way we've never seen Dutch politicians speak before. He has an international following. His message always seems to land.
Yes, that's partly because I think he is an outsider. The subtitle of our biography is not chosen in vain. I think it's the Avenger, not only of himself. He used to be member of the Liberal Party of Mark Rutte and Dylan Jessegus around the turning of the century. And he left with quite a bang of the door in 2004 when he thought that his party wasn't right-wing enough, wasn't addressing the issues of the population enough. And then he started his own Freedom Party. And I think from that moment on, he has tried to represent the people in the, let's say, the lower middle classes. He's from Limburg, a bit of a peripheral area in the Netherlands with a distinct accent. He doesn't have a university education, unlike many of his colleagues in parliament. So I think he represents a sort of a group that felt unheard, unseen, and that's probably the 10, 15, maybe 20% of the electorate that we already discussed. And I think his manner, his way of communication is very clear, very straightforward. His largest propaganda tool is his X account, previously Twitter account. He's completely depending on that, and also on what other media write about him, because he doesn't really have a party with a large propaganda machine to have the electoral campaign. So he's completely, and that shows the dark side of his character. He's very jealous and paranoid. He doesn't really allow other people to share his spotlights, and he's very afraid that people within his party will come up and steal the attention from him, and maybe even steal leadership. So that also shows the flaws in his party. That it makes it so dependent on his whims, on his moods, and that's, I think, the action last week to quit the government, I think, is an example of that.
Geertan, the clock has beaten us. Thank you, and to Adrian, Edvard, and Adam Boulton here in the studio as well. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.